Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody, dear colleagues. I should briefly introduce myself as there is no session chair. I'm Steph Scholten. I'm director of the Hunterian at the University of Glasgow in the UK. I'm also one of UMAC's vice chairs, and I'm a member of ICOM Standing Committee on Museum Ethics. I've just dropped in the chat just to make sure that everybody can pull up a copy, a link to the draft guidance on restitution and repatriation I'll be talking about in this next 20 minutes or so, and then there's the opportunity for a few questions before we move into a roundtable. I realized, we're nearing the end of this first joint UMAC-Universeum conference, which may turn out to have been the largest ever. Not sure what the overall numbers are. And I want to thank you all for persevering and sticking around to join this session, because 3 days on Zoom is a very, very, very long time. And however interesting all the content that has been presented, we're all zoomed out, I think, right now. And this particular session has been very long in the making, as we already planned to hold it in Sydney last year, September, but we all know what happened to that. And this session has shifted shape quite a few times, and even so in the last few days. So what you get now is first half an hour of me talking about the draft guidance for restitution and repatriation, and then we get an hour's roundtable on the return of items from university collections. And there'll be a whole range of new speakers in that to make it more interesting, to say the least, but I'll introduce them to you when we get to that point. I'll first present this draft guidance as the main outcome of an ICOM special project that I'll tell you more about in a minute. And at the end, as I said, there will be an opportunity for some questions. So drop your questions in the chat if you have them. In the roundtable, we have actually a number of people who have first-hand experience with restitution and repatriation projects from both sides that are always involved in such projects. And I think they will be inspiring and informational for all of us. But let me first get to talk about that ICOM special project that I mentioned already, and I will share my screen here. Unfortunately, not very exciting slides, basically mostly text. This is the link again to that particular document that is the guidance, the draft guidance. But let me start by quoting the application that we submitted to ICOM in late 2019. And I quote, "In 2020, UMAC, ICOM, ICME, and ICOM Australia will work together around the ethics of repatriation and restitution of museums and collections objects in universities, meeting with the goal of ICOM to research and address issues of decolonization. The aim of the project is to raise levels of awareness, expertise, and sensitivity in universities and their museums and collections, and to contribute to the body of knowledge around these issues in the wider museum community by drafting guidelines that can complement the Code of Ethics. The project will investigate the ethical framework for restitution and repatriation as provided by the ICOM Code of Ethics first and foremost, as well as studying other relevant policies, frameworks, and guidelines. Our assumption is that the desirability of the return of human remains to source communities, and more broadly, to deeply reconsider objects acquired in the context of colonial domination or war, is minimally challenged in the international museum community, especially those in university collections. The project will use university collections as case study examples to develop draft guidelines for restitution and repatriation and propose those for consideration by the ICOM board and membership. We think that university collections and museums are interesting and useful to use as examples for this analysis and reflection because of their value for knowledge production in the broadest sense of the term. Many university collections inside and outside museums in the Western world have been shaped by the exploratory endeavors of researchers who traveled the world and have amassed objects and artifacts from across the globe. The way universities and museums should consider these collections in a decolonized, or probably more accurately, still decolonizing 21st century world, in our relation with source communities and other stakeholder groups, is one of the more pressing issues on the worldwide museum agenda. And given the particular nature and diversity of university collections and the politically somewhat more neutral context in which university museums can often operate, combined with the intellectual resources they can draw in the wider universities, they are in a position to take the lead in some of the discussions that are of relevance to the museum sector as a whole. And that's the end of the quotes from the original application. And on the basis of that, ICOM awarded 4,800 euros for the project. So thank you, ICOM. In the project, Universeum became an associate partner. And our big plan was to use all the upcoming conferences of all the committees that were partners in their conference in 2020 to discuss this subject with their membership, bringing Indigenous experts and expertise to these conferences. But unfortunately, COVID forced a different methodology upon us, much more desk-based, working from home, collecting existing guidelines, policies and procedures, talking to experts from across the globe, drafting versions and revising those in a number of feedback loops to create the draft guidance that has been shared with you before the conference, and that is on the UMAC website. And I want to express my heartfelt thanks to all colleagues across the world who have provided materials, case studies, expertise, time, etc. to develop this. And I want to recognize the emotional labor that I've asked of members of originating communities in this process. I hope it will prove to be worth it and that the draft guidance will meet with a critical but positive reception. And there's already been quite a bit of useful feedback of that kind in the past 2 weeks since it's been opened up to a wider public. And I do invite you to share your ideas and comments now and after this conference, but before the end of September. It is the plan to use October to collate all feedback and create a final version of this guidance. That is, of course, if the overall feedback is that it's good to have such guidance, because if there were a lot of pushback against it, it would still be offered to ICOM, as I think that in itself would be an interesting outcome, but with the recommendation that it should probably be put on ice. I need to manage that, though we didn't have all the conferences, we did manage to create 3 online sessions that inform this work. During the annual Museums Association's conference in November 2020 in the UK, there was a session with UK university museums who are all or were actively involved with repatriation processes with source communities in Africa, Australia, and North America. And this last June, there was a combined COMAC, UMAC-ICOM Australia webinar supported by the National Museum of Australia. It was titled Polyphonic Perspectives, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Cultural Materials in Museums and University Collections, and Global Issues of Repatriation and Restitution. And here we are today, 3rd session with Universeum and UMAC. What has been really interesting since writing the application in 2019 is that the momentum for restitution and repatriation has shifted dramatically in some parts of the world. Many countries in Western Europe, former colonizers such as Germany, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, have expressed very clearly their intention to work with formerly colonized countries on the return of items that are felt to be of importance to them. I'm using the word item here, not objects, as some of the material we hold in our collections now, human remains and other, are considered to be living entities, not dead things by many. What was interesting in this past period was that almost on a weekly basis, new documents were produced, announced, circulated, conferences were held, webinars, talks, and even some high-profile books were published. And to me, that all indicates an official acceptance that colonial histories are unfinished business, and that the effects of that history still translates to inequalities in the world and in countries and societies everywhere today, but specifically in formerly colonizing countries. And I think that that realization of unfinished business is a good thing, as we need to acknowledge the wrongs of the past as part of the process of making the present and the future better. So with those thoughts in the back of the head, the draft guidance was put together. It builds on two documents, the ICOM Code of Ethics and on the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. But as we have learned from Henry McGee in his inspiring opening keynote at this conference, there are many more relevant internationally agreed treaties, conventions, and the likes that this work speaks to. But the Code of Ethics is the starting point on which the draft guidance is elaborating. And if accepted, this guidance can potentially do a number of things, but first and foremost, it can be used as a more operational clarification of the code that helps universities and their museums with these processes of return. If the guidance would be of help in the process of modernizing the Code of Ethics, a process that has recently started, or that ICOM would feel it could be redrafted in such a way that it can find wider application in the museum sector beyond university museums, is hard to predict. The second relevant document is UNDRIP. And for those who don't know it, a very brief bit of info on it. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted by the General Assembly on Thursday, 13 September 2007, by a majority of 144 states in favor. And today, the declaration is the most comprehensive institutional framework on the rights of Indigenous people. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. And it elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of Indigenous peoples. And UNDRIP contains a number of very clear articles about the rights of Indigenous people. For instance, paragraph 12.2 reads, states shall seek to enable the access and or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possessions through fair, transparent and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned. And UNDRIP was also chosen as a relevant document because of the aim of restitution in many cases is to return items, if possible, to the individuals and living communities for whom they have the most direct meaning and relevance. And in those processes, originating communities of Indigenous people are often the weakest party, as often their resources, levels of organization, etc., are less than, for instance, museums or governments. And in many places, there are no legal frameworks or mechanisms in existence that can help them. It is therefore important to empower the source communities in our approaches. And of course, it should be said that if there are legal frameworks or accepted policies and procedures, those should be followed. And this guidance is specifically meant for situations where those are not present. So, what is this draft guidance? I don't know how many of you have been able to look at it already, but it consists of three parts. And the first is a selection of relevant articles from the ICOM Code of Ethics and UNDRIP to provide context for the guidance. Second, the guidance proper, which is 2 pages of A4 only, that mostly describes the why and recommends the approach that universities can take. And I'll pick out a few things from it. but you should read it in full because it's concise and the language has been carefully considered. But I'll quote a few things. So this paper is meant first and foremost to inform and support universities regarding requests for the returns of items from their museums and collections, while acknowledging that there are many stakeholders that need to be involved in these processes. For generations, university museums have been collecting, organizing, displaying these collections and using them for research and teaching. Universities were at the center of political power when European colonizers spread across the globe. Over centuries, massive displacements of cultural objects, scientific specimens, and human remains affected peoples and places everywhere. University museums have a duty to respectfully care for the collections they hold and to encourage access and understanding for as many people as possible. University museums hold their collections in trust for past and future generations, with ongoing responsibilities associated with the items in the collections themselves and the express and implied wishes of the many collectors and donors, as well as of the many stakeholders involved. It is only now becoming widely recognized that the circumstances of acquisition of some of these items should be considered unacceptable and that holding certain items should be reconsidered. In general terms, unacceptable circumstances of acquisition of items refer to cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without people's free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. Originating communities or originating peoples and communities are best placed to understand what material is significant and important to them and what they wish to have returned. To be able to adequately engage with originating communities and other stakeholders on issues of restitution and repatriation, university museums should establish procedures that regulate the process and create clear points of contact for parties for information and restitution requests. As part of good collections practice, university museums should also commit to resourcing ongoing and collaborative research into the histories of their collections, to establish the provenances of items, and to share findings and approaches with originating communities, other relevant parties, and the wider public. And maybe last from this, university museums should acknowledge the value of dialogue with communities and colleagues across the world as an opportunity to empower people, build networks and relationships, and increase knowledge and understanding. Most fundamentally, this process contributes to healing some of the deep wounds caused by past actions and acknowledges the power of collections to make and remake relationships. It contributes to a future of new cultural practices, new knowledges, and new ways of sharing and learning. So far my quotes from the actual guidance. When I move to the third part of the guidance, which actually kind of gives operational recommendations of how the guidance could be implemented in practice. They're suggested there's 8 elements that can or should be considered when creating procedures, and they are about things like provenance research, transparency, dialogue, stakeholder engagement, respectful attitudes, criteria of assessment of repatriation requests, so what I can never pronounce, prioritization, and documentation. That's really fun. I will quote 3. First, that museums should develop a procedure that thoroughly defines the restitution process and addresses legal and ethical principles and professional responsibilities. And that procedure should be approved by relevant governing bodies and published online and be regularly updated. University museums should engage in collaborative research into their collections to establish the provenance of items. Wherever possible, they proactively share their findings directly with communities of origin and or relevant cultural and governmental organizations. And last, the outcomes of a restitution process need to be determined in consultative, collaborative processes outlined here, and may vary, but need to be led by the rights of Indigenous people to be self-determining with their cultural patrimony. The unconditional transfer of ownership rights is but one of the potential outcomes. So I will stop here with a very strong recommendation that you read the draft guidance in its entirety, as I cannot talk about all aspects of it at this point, and because of that, the language is precise and considered. Please send all your constructive remarks, suggestions, and feedback to the below email address. And I thank you beforehand, and once more, I thank all of those who have contributed. It has made a big difference. I'm happy to take questions, and I'll stop sharing. Now I've got to see some hands. And I'm not seeing hands. You can show yourself, actually. Sion, I see your hand, but I don't see your, there you are.
Thank you, Steph. First of all, your document was so concise and so expertly worded and so simple. It's been really helpful. As you know, South Africa has been grappling with this for the past 10, 15 years, if not 20 years. And we are at a policy stage with government. It's been very, very consultative. The problem is they have not, and this is what's holding the process up, is they have not separated the restitution from the repatriation. So they are struggling to combine repatriation of human remains with the restitution of cultural material. Universities have been involved extensively, communities have been involved extensively, and I think I sent you a copy of the draft legislation that is being proposed currently in South Africa. But we also don't foresee that that is going to be passed anytime soon, because nobody seems to agree. Some people think there should be a separate issue of restitution. And unfortunately, in our case, I've dealt with 2 cases of restitution, as well as I'm currently dealing with one. And we've done a reburial, 2007. I've dealt with an issue of reburial before with traditional communities, which worked out very well. The problem is when we talk about the restitution of cultural objects back to communities, in a particularly South African context, what is a big challenge is, where do those collections go? Those communities don't really want the objects back in their household. They're scattered. They don't have a museum. So the idea is that one would restitute them to a locality which is associated with the community, or a university, but not to the community as such. And we're talking about 1,000 years ago. We're talking about one cannot trace lineage. We're talking about this as such a sensitive issue because the communities are refusing to have DNA tests done. It's a highly, highly hot, contested topic, and all the universities are grappling with it at different levels. And those ones that have been successful have largely been based on bona fide claimant communities that have claimed from descent with DNA analysis. But when you start talking about prehistoric collections, which are most likely at universities, there are no guidelines. I just wanted to just briefly, I think I sent you, this is combined with an Indigenous knowledge policy that South Africa has also developed. Unfortunately, the one doesn't talk to the other in terms of intellectual property of that cultural material. And one of the biggest issues, and I'd like to hear from the panel who are all the participants today, we're dealing with a big issue of compensation. should restitution involve, should universities be financially compensating the return of this material to wherever? And I'm not sure, I haven't read your document recently, but I'm not sure whether the issue of financial compensation has been brought up. And I'd just like to hear your views about that.
Okay, thank you, Sion. Yeah, no, I think, I mean, the one thing that you described is it's complicated. It's not straightforward. All local contexts tend to differ. All individual cases tend to differ slightly. So whatever, you know, this, what, you know, something like this guidance cannot do, it cannot really tell you, you know, in detail how a particular situation will play out, but it will give it will give some ways of how to approach things. I know you've been doing a great deal of work in South Africa, and I know there's a lot of big questions that I do think that probably parties in South Africa need to start agreeing on, because otherwise there's no way forward. The issue of financial compensation is not part of the current guidance, so thank you for bringing that up. It's on in the background in a number of cases, and not sure if it's up to universities to deal with that question, but it's a toughie. I know that in Glasgow, actually, my university has reported on its benefits from slavery in the past, and it has put in a program with a value of £20 million over the next 20 years as a sort of a compensation mechanism. But it's, I don't know, it's a very tricky and difficult area. So I'll definitely give that some more thought. So thank you. Which makes me realize that we've reached actually the time to bring in some of those other experts. I think the roundtable link, Martin, is the same as the as this current one, right? So we can just move on. Okay, brilliant. So I would like to welcome you to the Roundtable Ethics, as it's announced in the program. And we've put it together to share with you some of the work on restitution and repatriation that's been going on in the past few years. And I'll be joined by a host of experts from both sides of the restitution process, and I will introduce them to you one by one as they join the conversation. Some of the names are not in the program, as the lineup has shifted because of all kinds of reasons, COVID being one of them. And I invite you to, again, to make comments and ask questions in the chat so we can come back to them more towards the end of this roundtable of about 1 hour. I will kick this off with 2 case studies, one from Nigeria, Africa, working with Aberdeen University, and one from Australia, involving the return of cultural heritage team from AYATSIS, which is short for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies and Manchester Museums. And those 2 case studies will be presented each in 10 minutes or so by those involved. And we start with the return of the so-called Benin bronze from Aberdeen to Nigeria. And in conversation will be Neil Curtis, Head of Museums and Special Collections, University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and Professor Bankole Sodipo, who is Professor and former Dean of Law at Babcock University in Nigeria, and a practicing barrister and specialist in intellectual property, technology, communications, and allied rights. I would like to give the floor to Neil and Bankole. Bankole, can you turn on your camera, please?
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to this round table, and I hope you can hear me okay. I want very quickly just to introduce how the story started in Aberdeen, and make a few comments actually on the criteria which are in the document that Steph's proposing. The University of Aberdeen has been involved in repatriation discussions for a number of years. The first one I was involved in was 2003. And out of that, we developed a procedure with criteria, and the criteria that developed through those years, I'm really pleased to see are basically the model for the ones in the document. We have the core of the procedure focuses on having discussion, having conversation. So we set up an advisory panel that discusses the case, and that includes a representative from the people making the claim, or as Nick Thomas has suggested recently, we should maybe be thinking of it as a proposal rather than a claim. So we have a more consensual discussion, and that discussion bringing in experts from within the university, from elsewhere. So on the panel that discussed the return of the Benin bronze, Steph was involved in that as a representative of another museum in Scotland, and Bankole as the representative from the people making the proposal. So we're talking about an item that was purchased by the university in 1957, but which originated in the sacking and looting of Benin City by a British force in 1897. So when we came to looking at the collection, this was a proactive case where previously repatriations I've been involved in, we've had a request has come from the source community or a body operating on their behalf. This was one where we took a step to find somebody to talk to and then develop that claim. So that was how we got in touch with Bankole, and he then was able to lead the discussions from Nigeria and assemble the right people and assemble a formal claim that came to the university. If I just quickly make a couple of points about the criteria in and they're in the appendix section 5, before passing over to Bankole for his comments on both what we've done in this particular case and maybe some comments about the document as well. That we've tried to make it that they're educative criteria, they're not prescriptive. So we're not setting up a particular form of connection, for example, see item 5C, connection between the item and the requesting party. We're not saying that they must be the legal descendant or the genealogical descendant or anything like that. We're saying let's discuss what is the connection. There are many forms of connection, and I think it would be wrong for us to predetermine that. Likewise, we look at the consequences of return and what that return would be. We're not saying it must be to a museum or any particular outcome. We're leaving that open as part of the discussion, but we do discuss it. We've also tried to have the discussion as much as is possible to be one of equality, so that we have to consider what is the significance to the people making the request and to the museum. So it's not just saying that the museum is a sort of default setting. You bring everything into discussion. And likewise, when looking at the future, what will happen if it's returned, if it's not returned to both parties. So the criteria are a way of structuring a discussion that mean that we work through all the relevant issues without having it predetermined that there are certain facts that must be met before you can continue a discussion. So on that, I think I'll pass over to Bankole for his thoughts and comments. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Neil. I think one of the things that's been helpful is the fact that there were no difficult or conditions attached to the transfer. And I think that is significant, particularly because the proposal which we're discussing talks about unconditional transfer. Yes, I got involved. I was actually on sabbatical at Queen Mary University of London, where I had done my PhD about 30 years back. And I, like Neil said, they made the approach, which also corroborates the intention in the proposal Steph has talked about, where a university museum initiates. So rather than waiting for there to be a proposal or a claim. And so when he got in touch with me, I was able to get who indicated that I must get the National Museums Commission involved. That is the body that's law vests with the power to do such things, such negotiations and so on. And so since this particular property was from Benin, the Oba's Palace in Benin, I got representatives of the Oba's Palace involved. And then also it was from Edo State, Nigeria, what is now Edo State. So I also got representatives of the Edo State government involved, the Secretary to the government, the Attorney General, and so on. And so with all this, we're able to continue the discussions and negotiations with NIL. And so we've signed off. And hopefully in another, maybe later on this month or early next month, Nigeria is going to collect the property from Aberdeen. But it then leads me to a number of issues in the proposal. One will be shipping issues, customs, insurance. And so what we are looking at is that we'll probably collect it physically, and then diplomatic bag. Then the interesting point in your proposal is a clause that says, if legally free to do so. And I'm really worried about that because it's an ICOM code of ethics. And when you look at ethics versus the law, law can be used as an instrument so that what is ethical will not be done. Most of this property were looted. So even though Aberdeen bought this thing, Aberdeen has taken the position that, yeah, we paid for it, but we couldn't have had title because of how the property came to the person who sold. And I think this is the position that other museums should take. There are some museums who have said that there are laws that prevent them from releasing this property, like the British museums. Those laws should be changed. Otherwise, advising the Nigerian government out of justice. Yes, they came to Benin, assuming that there were issues between them and the Benin Kingdom. They did not have any right to loot and remove all those property. Now, the other issue is there are some universities who say they don't want to talk to, there's a particular university, I won't mention the name, they don't want to talk to the federal government of Nigeria, they want to talk to the Oba's Palace. If you check the internet, it's awash in the last couple of weeks with the Oba's Palace saying the federal government should take charge and help us negotiate on all this property. But then there is a museum saying, no, we don't want to talk to the federal government. So I'm worried about this. And I think the last point I'd like to make is that we probably need the use of mediators. The International Committee for the Promotion of Return of Cultural Properties of UNESCO is meeting later on this month. And one of the properties they're looking at is the Benin Ife head. So they have a means of mediation. And so sometimes when these discussions get frosty, we should consider using such mediators so that the issues might be resolved. I think I would love to stop there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bankole. Those are all really relevant and useful remarks. I think some of the things we cannot change from a small individual university museum in a corner of the world. But I would agree that the guidance, what it's trying to impart is that the ethical position is that universities and university museums should be willing to consider repatriation of materials to the rightful people. And I know we can have a long discussion in some cases who those are, and Sharon also alluded to that in her comments before. And we do know that locally, I mean, the situation can be complex. So we have to negotiate, our way through, and mediation can be a mechanism through which that can be achieved. So thank you for that. And then the cost consideration is always an important one. I think that indeed, in each case, again, universities and claimants or the people that request a return should look at what those costs are and how they can best be met. Again, I wouldn't presume any particular way that it's either on the claimant or either on the university, but take a case-by-case approach, how that can best and most fairly be done. On that note, we can come back to some of this later on. We move to the second case study, which will be presented by Georgina Young. She's the head of exhibitions and collections at Manchester Museums of the University of Manchester in the UK. And she's joined by Jason Lyons, head of the Return of Cultural Heritage team at IATSIS that I already mentioned. And Jason is from the Wiradjuri Nation, and we'll start this presentation with a short video that was made at the Australia House handover ceremony in 2019, when items from Manchester Museums were handed over to representatives from the Gangalidda Garawa Nation, and we see Mangubadijarri speaking to us. If Martin, if you could start the video, that would be brilliant.
Okay, I do. 1 second.
As I said when I first heard the news, the repatriation of our sacred cultural heritage items is a fundamental part of the healing and reconciliation process, both within our communities and between our mob and the colonial state. Bringing these sacred cultural heritage items back to country where they belong is important and necessary for the purpose of cultural revitalization, because locked deep within these items and artifacts is our law, our histories, our traditions, our livelihood, and our stories. Article 12 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, the right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects, and the right to the repatriation of their human ancestral remains. We can keep our culture and our traditions alive and strong if we don't have access to the tools and items that allow us to practice, preserve, and develop these ancient and sacred customs. These cultural heritage items and artifacts here and all around the world must return back to country where they belong, because like us, they are of the land. They weren't made in some warehouse in China or in a factory in London. They came from the land, our home. They give my people hope, life, meaning, sustenance, and a future. As with all social movements towards change and progress, this is but the first step, a stepping stone in the right direction towards a better and more inclusive future. We share a dark history, but it's moments like this when we come together as one, united by our shared desire to do better, to be better, and to right the wrongs of the past, that we start to heal the spiritual wounds and the intergenerational trauma that still exists today. As a young Aboriginal person and as a proud Gangalidda man, this is to me and my community what true practical reconciliation looks like. It's not just flowery rhetoric or incremental or tokenistic change. This is real and substantial change, and it has become a reality because of the courage and conviction of people like Craig and Chris and Tamarin and the entire team at IATSIS, in partnership with people like Professor Thacker, Esme and Stephen, and all the wider community of Manchester University and Manchester Museum. The unconditional return back to country of these sacred cultural heritage materials will have a profound positive impact on the practice, preservation, and development of my people's culture, language, and traditions for generations to come. As a proud descendant of the oldest continuing culture in human history, and as someone whose people have walked across this land since the very first sunrise, I am honored to have the opportunity to carry on the work of my ancestors by bringing our sacred cultural heritage items and artifacts back to country where they belong. So on behalf of my peoples, the Gangalidda and Glasgow peoples, we thank you for your willingness to embrace the tide of change and open up a new chapter in the history of reconciliation between our two nations and all its peoples. As the late great Honorable Nyberton once said, we have been the dreamers, we have been the sufferers, now we are the builders. So let us continue to work together to build a better future for all our peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. Nagara Warajayanda, Nalata Miraja Yelada Yelada, Mirata Marajuka. Go now and be good. Be kind, be well, and be one with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. George.
Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Martin, for doing the technological sharing of the film. We started with Mangubadijarri's words because they're more powerful than anything I can say on what that repatriation has meant to Manchester Museum, to the University of Manchester, but more so to the Gangalidda people. And we actually returned as part of the same repatriation 43 secret, sacred and ceremonial items from our collection to 4 Aboriginal communities, the Gangalidda being just one. And the returns to country, which followed in 2019, 2020 and 21, kind of really contributed to the key ambition of IATSIS's Return of Cultural Heritage programme. And that's the return of Indigenous cultural heritage to Australia for the purposes of cultural revitalisation. And I'm going to invite Jason at this point, he's the director of that programme, just to say a few words of kind of introduction about the Return of Cultural Heritage project and set a bit of context from their perspective.
Thank you, Georgina. Can you hear me? Yep. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak with you today. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. It's such an important conference. The Return of Cultural Heritage program is a program that's funded by the Australian government. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies has received $10 million over 4 years, and so up until the 30th of June of 2024, to fundamentally work with Indigenous communities here in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also overseas collecting institutions and also private collectors to facilitate and seek the return of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage material from overseas collections. As I said, including private collectors. So the program enables Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to understand where their cultural heritage material is being held in overseas collections. One of the significant things that we are doing is, with information that is being provided to us by overseas collecting institutions, we are developing a Return of Cultural Heritage database, which will house information that is being provided to us by collecting institutions throughout the world and also private collectors. And that will be the first time that, certainly in Australia's history, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be able to, and researchers, I should say as well, will be able to go into a database and have a look at where their cultural heritage material is overseas, how it was acquired, and so forth. The program is also about influencing institutional repatriation practices, policies and guidelines, which is obviously very important to today's forum. And it's also about fostering relationships between overseas collecting institutions and also Indigenous communities. And I think can be demonstrated, particularly with the returns that we've done with overseas collecting institutions to this point, that fostering relationships between between overseas collecting institutions and Indigenous communities is something that the program has excelled at. Certainly our relationship between our institute and also the Manchester Museum, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection at the University of Virginia, and also the Illinois State Museum in Springfield, Illinois, is really demonstrates that it's really developed not only a really solid relationship between ourselves and the collecting institutions, but also between the collecting institutions and the Indigenous communities here in Australia.
Thanks, Jason. I was going to share some slides, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of sort of not share slides and concentrate on the chat, if that's all right, Steph. Are you happy with
yeah,
that?
no, I think it's great. I think it's really important actually to say that I want to thank IATSIS because I've had a lot of support and they've shared documents and knowledge around these processes that have been extremely useful. I also seem to notice, and this is also where I want to bring in Mike Pickering, our last expert on this panel. He's the Senior Repatriation Advisor at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. And to hear him reflect on what is great for overseas parties like us in this particular case is that there is an institution and a national museum that we can talk to. That gives a clear way in. And I think one of the things that Sion Tilly mentioned earlier on was that the issues that there are when you're trying to, connect, let's say, museums in different parts of the world with originating communities, that those structures are those connections quite often really hard, difficult to make when there's no such structures in place. Mike, can you say a few things from your vast experience in the repatriation area of what are effective mechanisms of working? I realized, and that's something that one last thing that I wanted to mention before I give you the floor, is that the return from Manchester has been very long in the making, right? It's not a project that, we started 6 months ago and now we're done. No, it's actually a process that's been literally over a decade, I think. Is that correct, George?
I suppose in a way we kind of root it back to around 2002, when Tristan Besterman was director of Manchester Museum. And we first started work on kind of the repatriation of human remains. So actually, it's quite long-rooted practice in Manchester Museum and the University of Manchester, and that has that helped. Having that heritage helped with in terms of engaging with IATSIS kind of from the off, from a position of having that experience. That said, I think what was really important was that time that we spent not just talking to IATSIS, but talking to Mangu, who you saw, and Donald Bob, a Garawa elder who came with him to receive material back. It made a huge difference to how our team understand that material. It makes a massive difference, and it makes a huge difference to the way that we now think about and classify cultural heritage and how we now foreground Indigenous perspectives in the way that we think. So I think the value of the relationship is not just in progressing the instance of return, it's also in what that's given to both us and IATSIS in terms of a relationship that we continue to work through, and that obviously you'll see today.
Okay, thank you. I think that's actually a good point, Mike. Maybe you can also reflect a bit on, we talk a lot about relation building. And do you think how important is that in the process versus a straightforward, more transactional kind of return of heritage?
Yep, well, thank you all for the opportunity. There's been so many things have arisen which I'd love to talk about at length, but I realise the time issues. Australia is actually fortunate in that we deal with Australian Indigenous populations and people every day. We work with them, answer the phone. There's not a day goes by when I don't have a conversation with somebody somewhere in Australia about some issue or just for goodwill conversation. We know Australian museums know the local contacts. It's not a hard ask to go to your local state museum or even university museums in Australia and say, who should we be speaking to about this particular issue? And we can generally put people on track. Repatriation, the return of be they remains, be they objects, is not the end of the process. That handover, although some governments like to see it as conveniently, that's it, we're done, we're out of here, no more expenditure. It's actually the recommencement of a process that had been left in limbo for a number of years. When collections were made, they were made from living people, and they were contemporary collections, with rare exceptions. That, you know, with the historic, prehistoric material, it was often done to show, collected to show human evolution, which is, you know, social evolution, which has been disproven. But it was still used to talk about contemporary issues, contemporary theories in anthropology and education. You know, they were looking at contemporary questions. And that's the opportunity we have when we use repatriation as a mechanism today. We reinstate culture as the focus of our work, not the objects, not the artistic merit of the objects, but the cultures behind those objects and the continuing importance of those objects or those remains to those cultures. So I think that that active engagement is a rich goldmine for all of us to get to deal with communities directly. And it's not that hard anymore. We all have, you know, we're all here sitting on Zoom. We've all got email. We've all got telephones. It's not hard and it's not expensive to engage with communities. I'll leave it there for the moment.
No, thank you, Mike. I think, again, you know, fair comment. I think if there's one takeaway from the COVID crisis is actually, I've spoken to more international colleagues in the past year and a half than ever before. You know, I've met them more, you know, more time with them on Zoom than ever before. And, you know, however nice it is to have a cold beer together, you know, there's many opportunities now to communicate and engage, which is actually an interesting question. Maybe, you know, Jason, you know, do you think that actually this period of COVID is actually going to speed up the options that we have for, you know, these processes? Are they going to make it easier?
It's a very interesting question, that one, Steph. We look in terms of the way our methodology, the way that we just adhering very strictly to the principles of ask first and free, prior, informed consent. Certainly, what our methodology is at IATSIS is to we may visit a community 2 or 3 times in order to seek the community's guidance and instructions about return request or request for material. So certainly our preferred method is to go and visit community on country, where the community can and relevant representatives of the community can determine who attends meetings, where that meeting is held, and those sorts of things. I think it's a really, I mean, you mentioned was there before. I think that for us the most critical aspect of repatriation is relationships. And in order to build relationships and in order to build trust, we think it's really critical that what we do is spend time out on country in various communities throughout Australia, where we're sitting down face to face with often cultural authorities, so senior men or senior women within a particular nation. And we're building trust, and we're spending, normally what we'll do is spend 2 or 3 days with community, going through every aspect of whether it be a museum's policy, their decision-making processes. We look at individual items and tap into living knowledge of community members to get them to confirm whether the material is theirs or not. And so, look, we would love to do to speed things up and those sorts of things, but it's sort of, we think that the most critical aspect of it is that trust and building trust and relationships, which is best done face to face, in relevant communities and that sort of thing. So although in saying that, we are currently working with the Warramungu community about 500 kilometres north of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. We have conducted 2 community visits to this point, and we're just putting the finishing touches on a return request to a number of overseas collecting institutions. And that meeting, because of COVID restrictions here in Australia at the moment, is going to be done via Zoom. So look, our preferred method is face-to-face, but certainly meetings can be done. You know, we can facilitate return request via Zoom. But in this case, we're only doing it because we've already been there on 2 separate occasions.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that is that's really valuable. Can I? And I think George, you know, she was referring to that, you know, and there's the example of our colleagues at the Pitt Rivers Museum, who've been working with the Maasai people, and they. I think it's the actual engagement of people around the collections that can be really meaningful. I wanted to flag up something, Neil. In one of the interviews you did around the Benin bronze return, you actually spoke about time, I think, as a measure of respect almost, of how, you know, we deal with each other. Do you remember what you said? You got to unmute, Neil.
As I say, I can't remember that specific thing. I said so much that, but I think that there is a point in there I really want to pick up, that I think so much of this is about an institutional attitude, just from the point of view of the museum. And you know, as George said, that's what I mean. We're talking, you know, both of our institutions, it's 20 years that we've been involved with this sort of issue. So it's become natural, it's become normal, it's not threatening. I mean, and I think I'd want to reassure other museums who've not been involved that it's a good thing to be part of from that institutional point of view. The understanding we've had of the collection and of the people associated with it is so much better. That it really, and I think people often think of it as a threatening, fearful thing to get into, and I really want to emphasize it's so not. But I think the important bit is that it is about respect and time, and working at the time scale that is appropriate, and not trying to run it from a museum timescale where we either want to get it, you know, drag it out as long as possible to avoid making a decision, or the other extreme to push it through quickly in a couple of months because we want to tick the box that we've done it. And I think it's really important that we focus on the community that we're working with, and what are their interests, what do they want, both in the time and the outcome, and allow that to lead us. That there is a danger that museums could start pushing too hard in the wrong time in the wrong places. So I think it's got to be a respectful conversation. And I think that trust clearly develops through that process, and trust can form in lots of different ways. I'm slightly conflicted by the long-term relationship. I don't think that should be a necessary outcome. It may happen, it may not, but I want to leave that to the community that we're working with. I don't think we should force it. And there's a danger that a successful repatriation is seen as one which has a long-term relationship formed. I think we've got to be a lot more organic about it. And, you know, I think, yes, time is important in this, but it's got to be, you know, all the people's time and respect.
I think that's important to realize, that I think every process will be different, and whatever form the engagement takes, how long it takes, what the actual outcome will be, whether it's unconditional return or whether there's other more lasting relationships between people and institutions, is not something that should be presupposed, but it's actually something that should come out of the process that you go through together, and that is part of the trust that needs to be built. I think, and then, you know, it may come out naturally in a sense. I do realize, I think, that in some cases, of course, there's a very strong political motivation from either side to do something, if I may call it that, and then timeframes can be really short. There can be you know, the way we work in project formats, which means like, okay, you have money for 1 year to do something, or I heard like Ayatsis has money for a now a project or projects until 2024. I mean, there's always a horizon. Well, actually, this should become a fundamental part of what we do. If I look at the Hunterian, it's got 1.5 million objects. You know, there's, even if a small, and it's likely that never more than a very small proportion of the objects in our museum will be returned, that still will take a very considerable effort over a long period of time that should be embedded in our day-to-day work, I feel. Are there any questions in the audience, or maybe if I may also return to Bankole for a moment, because you are now, there's so many institutions and countries that now want to engage with Nigeria and Benin around the around the bronzes. How is that dynamic managed on your end, if I may ask you that, if you can speak to that?
Yes, I can. The role I've tried to play is just like mediate, because they're very since for the Benin property and the Edo state government and the federal government, and I was able to maneuver and get all of this. I think it's going to be very important. Because it's not easy to get to the Oba's palace or to get an appointment with him and so on. So just ensuring that none of the parties feels that they're being taken for granted, so that at least they're speaking with one voice. And the same thing goes for other property like Ife property, Nok property, because from different parts of Nigeria, a lot of property were taken. And I'm looking forward to doing collaborative research and getting teams to work with any of the universities over there to data, to do a lot of research and writing that will actually feed into this movement. Because sometimes some people just don't bother. Why do we need it? Like the lady from South Africa said, I mean, they don't want to keep it in their home, so where are you going to keep it? We need a new museum, and so on and so forth. So these are very interesting questions.
Some people may say that actually the case of the Benin bronzes, however long it has taken to get to this point, is a relatively straightforward case, because I mean, it's such a clear case of colonial violence. While many other collections have come to museums in much more ambiguous ways, often with lots of associated data, so we actually don't know what is what, where it's from, not even know so who to talk to if we were to consider return of materials. Do you think that the return of the Benin bronzes in that sense is a unique case, and that, for instance, Nok materials or sculpture or other materials will be more complicated?
Yes, I mean, the case for the Benin property is that the palace and surrounding grounds were looted, and the things were taken after the war, so to say, with about a little over 100 years ago. And it's clearly, I mean, more taken from other parts of the country. But as your proposal says, the material you prepared indicates that if they were not taken with full consent, so I think it's the wordings of that, I think is fantastic, because sometimes some of those things were taken under some deception, you know,
Yes.
and that's part of the reason why I said there may be need to do some more research into this thing, so that the ones which were given, the ones which were bought, do not need to be returned because they were gotten not in the same manner.
I think that's a very important point. I think we should consider, but I know that maybe goes way too far for many people, is that it doesn't actually really matter how things have come into the collections in Western museums, but it's actually the need of the requesting people that should be the first consideration. And then whether or not they were, stolen, bought, doesn't really matter. But maybe again, that is a bridge too far. I think the definition that I used about consent was actually, I think that was handed to me by Yilda, who's also here. It's part of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So I think it's a very powerful definition. Neil.
Yes, it was just to note that the first repatriation I was involved with, looking again back to those criteria, the one that was critical there was about significance of the item. The way in which this is a sacred bundle to the Kainai in Canada, the way in which it had been acquired was, messy, confusing, but that wasn't the crux of the discussion. The crux was that the returning this item was very important for spiritual and cultural rejuvenation, and that's where the return of the Benin bronze is very different, because although that is part of our awareness of what this is about, it was the circumstances of acquisition that were so wrong. So I think having those criteria open that allows for these different relationships, that's really important.
Okay, thank you, George.
Yeah, I think this is really pertinent to what you just said, Steph, is really pertinent to the case with us and IATSIS. And I think one of the things that I was going to have a chat to Jason about earlier, and I'm going to sort of open it up for him a bit now, is about what our case study really began to show is how the repatriation of cultural heritage material can strengthen communities and culture. Mm. And I think it'd be really good if Jason could expand a little bit on that in terms of with reference to return of cultural heritage projects wider work, because actually that is the driving factor for that repatriation. And the work that we've done with IATSIS means that is now far more significant in our decision-making criteria than it perhaps was before we had that direct experience. So,
great. Jason, please.
Unmute myself there. So I lost you there for a little bit, Georgina, but you were talking about the different ways in which Indigenous peoples, well, certainly here in Australia, and museums classify material.
You can talk about that one as well, because that one's a good one also. But I think what I was particularly drawing on was what difference it made on country and the difference it made to cultural revitalisation, because that has become much more significant in our thinking together.
Look, absolutely. I mean, the importance of returning material to communities and back to country, cannot be overstated. We have absolutely seen in the since 2019, since we started doing the first returns under the program, that even people within the institute that knew as Aboriginal people and as Torres Strait Islander people knew that understood very well the significance of material in overseas collections and the impact that would have in communities here in Australia, have been blown away by the significance. I mean, sort of what has absolutely been demonstrated to us very, very clearly is that returning material supports cultural revitalisation and maintenance, and we've absolutely seen that. I think the example of the video with the Gangalidda people and Mangubadijarri, the demonstration, unfortunately didn't get an opportunity to go to the on-country return celebration, but from all reports, the return celebration at Mangubadijarri in Burketown in North Queensland was attended by over 150 Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and people were commenting about how that was the first time the return of that material was the first time that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in that community had an opportunity to celebrate together. So the impact that it had on reconciliation. The event was also attended by the British High Commissioner here in Australia, and Her Excellency was blown away by the event as well. We've certainly seen that repatriation supports the development of healing relationships, and it's look from our point of view, it's really encouraging to see that the guidance mentioning things, acknowledging the wrongs of the past, talking about the importance of collaborating with communities of origin, empowering peoples, building networks and relationships, contributing to healing and a future of new cultural practices. From our way of thinking, the guidelines and the fact that the guidelines mention these really critical things to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can only be a really good thing. And we certainly, congratulate Steph and others for on developing such a a terrific set of guidelines, which we think will really make a tremendous difference. I think look, what repatriation did, and I think this was really demonstrated with the Manchester return, was what it does is it creates and renewing the relationships, creates relationships between Indigenous communities and collecting institutions through repatriation. So the two parties create a privileged space, if you like, where new learning can happen, and where exciting new stories can happen. It's sort of so often you hear about the collections of material in overseas, and it's all doom and gloom and bad stories and all those sorts of things. Through repatriation, it's presenting the opportunity to create new stories, positive stories. By inviting Indigenous communities into collecting institutions through repatriation, as I was saying, that space is created, and it provides an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to exercise agency. For material that stays in overseas collections, it gives an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to express how that material should be displayed, what stories should be told about that material. So this is really important. But again, I go back to that, building relationships, and how that has. We've certainly seen how repatriation has promoted healing and reconciliation here in Australia amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So this is really significant, even more significant than we anticipated.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jason. I think it's important, of course, that there is large bits of the world, New Zealand, Australia, USA, North America, Canada as well, where, of course, let's say, originated communities live side by side with museums that have collected their belongings. And I wanted to bring in Mike to maybe reflect a bit on that, because as an overseas institution, it feels slightly different to be, it feels even more inappropriate maybe to hold certain things. But in Australia itself, as in New Zealand and North America, there's museums actually in a similar position, but closer to the people from which the materials originate. How do you work that? How do you work that relationship, Mike?
Well, what I've learned is in my own work is that I know a lot about Australian Indigenous cultures, and to acknowledge that I don't know much about other Indigenous cultures. However, I've learned that there will be people out there who do, and I can go to them to ask for advice. And we've returned remains sorry, I'm chasing a cat away. We've returned remains to the United States and to New Zealand by relying on local knowledge and local guidance. It's breaking away from the idea that the the curator has to do all that groundwork. I mean, the outcome here is repatriation. It's not aggrandizement of the curator. We make a contribution through repatriation. I also want to say that repatriation is not just the return of the materials, objects, be they remains. It's the return of authority, it's the return of responsibility, and both of which are acts of empowerment. And I've seen on the ground a number of cases where the return of materials has, at the time of return, clearly empowered people of the community. A group of men standing around sacred objects with tears in their eyes, an absolute joy about having those objects back in their community again. Particular case from the Kimberley where objects were returned and all the drug dealers in the small town immediately left because the elders had been re-empowered through the return of those sacred objects. They had their authority back. So it's important to see the consequences of these returns. They're not just symbolic acts, they have real impacts on the ground and in the community in terms of empowerment and in community healing.
That's a powerful thing to say, Mike. You said also in the chat that a positive memory is a long-term relationship. I thought there was also like great symbolism in that.
Yes, well, sorry. When I started at the National Museum of Australia 20 years ago, we were a target for many attacks by Indigenous activists and advocates. What's a white person doing in charge of remains and objects? These objects should be with an Aboriginal organisation, which no argument there. But over the years, through these engagements, there's been an increased development of trust. Now, it's not set in concrete, that trust. One slip and we all go back to day zero. So it's a trust that has to be maintained by museums. But nonetheless, that investment, that trust is communicated not just between the museum and a community, but from community to community. So people will come to us now and ask for advice and they'll ask for assistance in repatriation processes. And that's, that's a development of museum practice, museum theory, museum ethics has all come through that. It's also increasing it. The act of repatriation increases our knowledge of contemporary cultures. And if we were to stack up the publications about contemporary engagements with communities on one side of the scales, and then stack up the weight of the objects and the remains on the other side of the scales, I think we'd find that the new knowledge generated far outweighs the objects that we've repatriated in significance.
Fair enough, I think, Mike. On that note, we are nearing time. Just an opportunity for a few final comments, maybe in support of the way we, or about the way we can take this guidance further. Jason, if you want.
Look, I think, as I was saying, I think that, in general, our comments about the new guidelines are extremely positive. We certainly like the fact that the guidelines talks about the return of secular material as well. So often you read guidelines and policies, and it specifically refers to one particular aspect of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which talks about the repatriation of ancestral remains and ceremonial material, which is obviously critical. But certainly we have, in the conversations that IATSIS has had with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people all over Australia, I mean, secular material or so-called secular material is just as significant to communities as ceremonially and or sacred material. We've absolutely heard that. I mean, Mike just mentioned an example there. I mean, just recently some stone artifacts were returned to a community in Victoria, and adults were in absolute tears. You know, so what would be considered by an archaeologist as debitage to a community, they're absolutely priceless. They're treasures because of their association with, you know, with ancestors and those sorts of things. So, look, in terms of next steps, I mean, we as I said, we think that these guidelines, if fully implemented, will make a tremendous difference. You know, we you know, look forward to continue to work with you know, collecting institutions right throughout the world. I mean, at this stage, I mean, the response that we've had from overseas collecting institutions is not only providing us with information about the material in their collections, but also the number of institutions that are, I mean, at this stage, we've got 66 institutions who have also indicated to us that they're willing to accept a return request, which, you know, when we first started in 2018, I mean, that result was just unthinkable. And so that in itself, I mean, to return half of that material to Australia is probably, you know, 10 to 15 years worth of work or whatever it may be. But look, as Mike said earlier, you know, I mean, if your objective is to engage, and, you know, as prescribed in the guidelines, if your objective is to engage with Indigenous communities, there are a range of organisations and people here in Australia that can help you do that, including IATSIS. If you're seeking the return of the material and working with communities, they probably put you in contact with us. But you know, there is some really positive times ahead. I'm certain of that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Maybe Bankole, famous last words, if you have them, for us. Maybe that's a big challenge and unfair. Oh, okay. Neil or George?
Yeah.
Sorry, Bankole, there you are.
Yeah.
Yes, I just want to commend the work you've done, Steph, and I hope that you get the buy-in of universities and the people who put their word where the mouth is in terms of projects that go on from there, because it would be interesting if we see some collaboration and relationship that arise from the return of all those properties going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bankole. Neil, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just to say, I mean, I think the important thing is that this is the purpose of museums. We're about increasing understanding, and I think we're widening our meaning of the word understanding, but it is what we're for, it's what we're about.
George?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's part of what we're about, and I think I think we will only get so far with firsts and case studies. And what I value in the guidance is that it's setting a kind of a platform for a kind of work across the piece and not just in isolated institutions. So for me, you know, it's a really valuable piece of work to be taking forward to set that ground and to kind of, I suppose, start to establish some of this practice that we've seen over the last few years emerging in a kind of policy statement. And I think that that's certainly something for Manchester that we're looking to next, is about kind of how do we solidify what we've done, how do we bring it into our practices, our culture, our kind of everything we think about as a museum. And that, I suppose, is where we go next, and your work is certainly helpful in achieving that.
Okay, thank you, George. On that note, because we know that Silke is waiting to give a final keynote and we can close this long 3 days, which has been brilliant. Thank you so much, all who have contributed here to the session. Jason, Bankole, Mike, Neil, and George, really brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to everybody's comments and feedback on the draft guidance. We see where we can take this. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Sebastian. And I think we remain on the same Zoom. Is that correct, Frederic?